Sometimes the people who save your life never meant to become part of it. The snow had erased almost everything by the time the highway disappeared behind another curtain of white. Headlights faded into a blur, road signs became pale ghosts, and the frozen wind pushed against every passing vehicle as if it wanted the entire state of Montana to stop moving. Rebecca Turner tightened both hands around the steering wheel of her aging Ford Escape, forcing herself to focus on the narrow tracks left by the truck ahead. She had driven through winter storms before. She knew better than to panic, but this storm felt different. It swallowed sound, it swallowed distance, it even swallowed confidence. Her phone had already lost signal nearly 20 miles earlier and the GPS map had frozen on the same lonely stretch of highway. She glanced at the dashboard clock. 5:18 p.m. sunset had arrived early beneath heavy clouds, painting the world in cold shades of blue and gray. The heater struggled against the freezing air leaking through the aging door seals. Rebecca rubbed her hands together at the next stop sign, wondering whether she should turn around or keep searching for the rural community center where she volunteered every December. Unfortunately for her, less than a mile away, someone much smaller was losing a race against the same storm. She never saw the little figure at first. A sudden gust of snow swept across the road like a white curtain, and when it cleared, a child stood near the shoulder wearing a bright red knit hat that barely reached the girl's eyebrows. She couldn't have been older than 7. She hugged a worn stuffed rabbit tightly against her winter coat while staring into the blowing snow with frightened blue eyes. Rebecca slammed the brakes carefully, her SUV sliding several feet before coming to a gentle stop. Her heartbeat pounded louder than the engine. She checked the mirrors, no other cars, no nearby houses, nothing except endless pine trees bending beneath fresh snow. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the bitter wind. The cold bit her cheeks instantly. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes. "Hey, sweetheart," she called gently, keeping her voice calm enough not to frighten the little girl. "Are you okay?" The child looked up but didn't answer. Her tiny fingers clung tighter to the stuffed rabbit. Rebecca slowly crouched several feet away, lowering herself to the girl's eye level. Years of volunteering had taught her that frightened children rarely trusted adults who rushed toward them. "My name is Rebecca," she said with a warm smile. "I'm not going to hurt you," the little girl finally whispered. "I can't find Daddy." Rebecca's heart sank. "What's your name?" "Lucy." "That's a beautiful name." The child looked behind her toward the forest where snow covered every branch like powdered sugar. "Daddy told me to stay in the cabin, but I saw the lights outside. Then I couldn't find the path anymore." Rebecca looked around carefully. There wasn't a cabin in sight. Every direction looked exactly the same beneath the storm. "How long have you been out here?" Lucy only shrugged, her lower lip trembling from cold. Rebecca removed one glove and gently touched the girl's mitten. It felt almost frozen. "Okay," she said softly. "First we're getting warm." She carefully offered her hand instead of grabbing the child. After a long moment, Lucy reached for it. The tiny fingers shook even through thick mittens. Rebecca led her carefully back toward the SUV. Warm air filled the cabin as soon as they climbed inside. She adjusted the heater toward the passenger seat and wrapped one of her emergency blankets around Lucy's shoulders. The little girl smiled for the first time, though it lasted only a second before worry returned to her face. "Daddy's going to be scared," she whispered. Rebecca handed her a bottle of water and a packet of crackers from the emergency kit she always carried. "Then we'll help him find you." Lucy nodded but looked down at the stuffed rabbit again. "Daddy always finds me." Those words lingered in the quiet cabin longer than they should have. Rebecca attempted another phone call. No signal. She switched on the weather radio instead. A severe blizzard warning repeated every few minutes, urging everyone to stay off secondary roads until sunrise. Sunrise. Rebecca looked through the windshield toward the invisible highway. Driving deeper into the storm could become dangerous. Staying still might be safer, but somewhere nearby, her father was almost certainly searching for his missing daughter. What she didn't know was that dozens of black SUVs were already spreading across the mountains with disciplined precision. Search teams moved silently through forests, frozen creeks, abandoned logging roads, and snow-covered cabins. Every passing minute increased the urgency. Every radio transmission repeated the same short instruction: find the little girl before dawn. Rebecca noticed Lucy staring toward the windshield. "Do you know where your cabin is?" she asked gently. Lucy hesitated before pointing toward the thick forest instead of the road. "Daddy said nobody was supposed to know." Rebecca smiled patiently. "That's okay, we'll figure it out together." Then something caught her attention. Far beyond the falling snow, almost invisible between the trees, several distant lights appeared for only a second before disappearing again. They weren't headlights traveling along the highway. They were moving through the forest itself. Rebecca felt an uneasy chill that had nothing to do with the weather, and before the first light of morning ever reached those mountains, someone powerful enough to move an army through a snowstorm would arrive looking for one frightened little girl. Rebecca kept glancing at the windshield every few seconds, hoping the distant lights would grow closer instead of disappearing behind another wave of snow. They flickered once, then vanished completely. The silence inside the old sport utility vehicle felt strangely comforting compared to the wind outside. The heater hummed softly while Lucy sat wrapped in the emergency blanket, slowly finishing the crackers Rebecca had given her. Color had begun returning to the little girl's cheeks, but worry still lingered in her eyes. She looked no older than 7, yet she carried herself with an unusual calm that did not seem natural for a child lost in the middle of a blizzard. Rebecca reached for the weather radio again, the same warning repeated in an even more urgent tone. Roads across several counties were becoming impassable, and emergency responders advised everyone to shelter where they were until conditions improved. Rebecca sighed quietly. Under normal circumstances, she would have followed that advice without hesitation. Tonight felt different. Somewhere beyond the white wall surrounding them, a father was searching for his daughter. She could not imagine leaving him to wonder whether his little girl was still safe. Lucy suddenly looked toward the passenger window. "He is coming," she whispered with complete certainty. Rebecca smiled gently. "I hope so. He always comes." There was no fear in Lucy's voice this time, only confidence. Rebecca found that strangely reassuring, although she could not explain why. She opened the glove compartment, searching for the folded county map she had almost forgotten she owned. The paper crackled as she unfolded it across the steering wheel. Most of the surrounding land consisted of forest, scattered ranches, old logging roads, and only a handful of cabins marked several miles apart. None appeared close enough for a child to have wandered this far on foot unless she had been outside much longer than she realized. Rebecca studied Lucy carefully. Her winter boots were expensive. Her coat was thick enough for sub-zero temperatures. Even the little rabbit she carried looked carefully repaired instead of replaced, as though someone valued it far beyond its price. Nothing about the child suggested neglect. Everything suggested she had been deeply loved. What Rebecca did not know was that less than 5 miles away, disciplined teams were quietly dividing the mountain roads into search sectors. Their movements were calm, efficient, and strangely coordinated despite the storm. Every vehicle carried the same instruction: find Lucy before sunrise, no unnecessary risks, no unnecessary attention. Rebecca folded the map again after realizing it offered almost no help beneath so much fresh snow. "Lucy, do you remember anything about the cabin? A lake? A bridge? A mailbox?" The little girl thought carefully before answering. "There is a big tree that bends over the roof. Daddy said it protects the house from the wind." Rebecca smiled. "That sounds like a pretty special tree." Lucy nodded proudly. "Daddy planted it before I was born." Rebecca looked back toward the endless forest. There could have been hundreds of trees shaped that way. The clue was almost impossible to use, yet made the invisible cabin feel real. She checked her phone one more time, still no signal. Then, without warning, a single notification appeared before disappearing again. One tiny bar of reception. She immediately dialed emergency services. The call attempted to connect for several seconds before failing completely. She lowered the phone with quiet frustration. "Almost," she whispered. Outside, the wind shifted direction. Snow no longer swept sideways. Instead, it drifted gently downward in thick flakes that reflected the pale glow of the headlights. Rebecca stepped outside for only a moment, listening carefully. Beneath the wind, she thought she heard something distant. Not thunder, engines. Several of them. She climbed back inside and turned off the SUV headlights to conserve the battery. Darkness surrounded them instantly except for the soft dashboard lights. Lucy leaned closer to the window. "They found us." Rebecca followed the little girl's gaze. At first she saw nothing, then one pair of headlights appeared between the trees. Another followed, then another. None of them drove recklessly. Each vehicle moved with deliberate precision, maintaining perfect spacing despite the storm. Rebecca counted at least 6 before she stopped trying. They were not police cruisers. They were identical black sport utility vehicles moving silently through the snow as though every driver knew exactly where to go. Her heartbeat quickened. She reminded herself that there could be a perfectly ordinary explanation. Perhaps a private search party, perhaps neighbors helping one another. Yet something about the disciplined formation made the scene feel larger than that. The lead vehicle stopped nearly 100 feet away. Its headlights remained low, never blinding the old Ford. The remaining vehicles formed a quiet circle at respectful distances without blocking every possible exit. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Men wearing dark winter coats stepped into the falling snow. None of them shouted. None of them ran. They simply scanned the surrounding forest with calm professionalism before one man approached alone. Rebecca instinctively locked the doors, then immediately questioned whether she was overreacting. The approaching stranger stopped several feet from the hood, removed one leather glove, and slowly raised an empty hand where she could clearly see it. His voice remained steady even through the wind. "Miss, we believe you may have found someone very important to us." Before Rebecca could answer, Lucy pressed her small hand against the passenger window, smiled for the first time since they had met, and quietly whispered one word: "Home." Rebecca hesitated for only a heartbeat before unlocking the doors. Every instinct told her to remain cautious, yet nothing about the man outside suggested panic or aggression. His movements were measured, his shoulders remained relaxed despite the relentless snow. Even from several feet away, she noticed the quiet confidence in the way he stood, as though he had spent years solving impossible situations without raising his voice. Lucy had already unbuckled her seatbelt. She pressed both hands against the passenger window, smiling with unmistakable relief. "He sent them," she whispered. Rebecca gently placed a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "Stay here for just one more minute." Lucy nodded without arguing. Rebecca stepped into the freezing air and carefully closed the driver's door behind her. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached the stranger halfway between the vehicles. He appeared to be in his early 40s, wearing a dark wool coat over tailored winter clothing that somehow remained immaculate despite the storm. A small radio rested near his collar, but he ignored it completely while speaking to her. "My name is Daniel," he said calmly. "Thank you for stopping for her." Rebecca studied his face. There was genuine gratitude there, mixed with obvious exhaustion. "Is she your daughter?" Daniel smiled faintly and shook his head. "No, I work for her family." Rebecca glanced toward the line of black sport utility vehicles. "There are a lot of people looking for one little girl." Daniel looked back at the forest before answering. "She means everything to someone." The words lingered between them. Rebecca nodded slowly. She understood that much without further explanation. Daniel lowered his voice. "Would you mind if I confirmed that she is unharmed?" Rebecca stepped aside. "Of course." He approached the passenger side carefully, never moving quickly enough to frighten Lucy. The little girl opened the door before he even reached it. Daniel crouched in the snow until he was at eye level. "Miss Lucy." She immediately wrapped her small arms around his neck. "I got lost." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, relief washing across his face. "I know. Everyone has been waiting for you." Lucy looked around the snowy road. "Is Daddy angry?" Daniel smiled with surprising warmth. "No, he has only been worried." Rebecca watched the exchange quietly. Whatever organization these people belonged to, the concern they showed for the child felt completely genuine. Daniel stood and turned back toward Rebecca. "Her father is on his way." "How far away?" "Not far anymore." As if summoned by the question itself, another pair of headlights appeared beyond the trees. Unlike the others, this vehicle traveled alone. It moved slowly across the untouched snow before stopping several yards behind the search convoy. Nobody approached it. Nobody opened its doors. Every member of the search team instinctively straightened their posture without receiving a single command. Rebecca noticed the subtle change immediately. Respect settled over the clearing like another layer of snow. Daniel quietly adjusted his gloves. "He is here." The driver's door of the final vehicle opened. A tall man stepped into the cold morning darkness. His charcoal overcoat reached nearly to his knees, and snow collected across his shoulders within seconds. He did not hurry toward the child. He simply stood still for a brief moment, scanning the scene with calms, searching eyes until they found Lucy sitting safely inside Rebecca's vehicle. The little girl gasped, "Daddy," before anyone else could move. Lucy climbed out of the passenger seat and ran through the shallow snow. The man met her halfway, dropping to one knee just before she reached him. She threw herself into his arms with complete trust. He held her tightly without saying a word. Rebecca looked away for a moment, feeling as though she had witnessed something deeply personal. The storm seemed quieter now. Even the wind softened around the reunion. What she did not know was that every member of the search team had been silently holding their breath for hours, waiting for exactly this moment. The man finally stood with Lucy resting comfortably against his shoulder. He brushed a few snowflakes from her red knit hat before speaking softly enough that only she could hear. The little girl nodded several times, then pointed directly toward Rebecca. The man's attention shifted for the first time. His eyes met Rebecca's across the snowy clearing. They were steady, thoughtful, and impossible to read. There was no display of wealth or authority in his expression, only unmistakable gratitude carried by someone accustomed to protecting the people he loved. He walked toward her alone, leaving everyone else exactly where they stood. Daniel and the others remained several yards behind without following. Rebecca suddenly became aware of how ordinary she looked beside the polished convoy. Her winter boots were covered in slush, her scarf hung unevenly around her neck. A few loose strands of hair had escaped beneath her knit cap hours earlier. None of it seemed to matter. The stranger stopped at a respectful distance and extended his hand. "My name is Luca Moretti," he said quietly. "There are not enough words to thank you for bringing my daughter safely back to me." Rebecca accepted the handshake, surprised by the warmth of his gloved hand despite the freezing air. "I only did what anyone would have done." Luca held her gaze for one thoughtful moment before answering. "No, not everyone would have stopped in a storm like this, and I never forget kindness." Rebecca released Luca's hand, expecting the conversation to end with a polite thank you before everyone disappeared into the storm. Instead, the silence stretched comfortably between them. Snow drifted lazily through the headlights while Lucy remained tucked safely against her father's side, her small fingers still clutching the worn stuffed rabbit. The little girl looked healthier already, as though simply being close to him had chased away the fear that had shadowed her face all evening. Rebecca noticed the way Luca quietly brushed a loose strand of hair away from his daughter's forehead before pulling her knit hat down a little farther over her ears. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet it revealed more about the man than anything else she had seen. Whatever else he might be, he was first a father. "She told me you kept the heater running the whole time," Luca said. "She was freezing," Rebecca answered. "Anyone would have done the same." A faint smile appeared for barely a second. "You keep saying that," Rebecca shrugged, "because it is true." Before Luca could respond, Lucy tugged gently on his sleeve. "Can she come to breakfast?" she asked with complete sincerity. Rebecca laughed softly, surprised by the innocent invitation. Luca looked down at his daughter before returning his attention to Rebecca. "She has always believed that every kind person should become a friend." Lucy nodded enthusiastically. "Friends eat pancakes." Daniel smiled discreetly several feet away, while a few members of the search team exchanged amused glances. The tension that had dominated the snowy clearing since their arrival slowly dissolved into something unexpectedly warm. Rebecca crouched beside Lucy once more. "I think your father probably wants to get you home first." Lucy frowned thoughtfully. "You can come another day." Rebecca smiled. "Maybe." Luca watched the exchange without interrupting. There was quiet appreciation in his expression, mixed with something more cautious that Rebecca could not quite identify. He looked toward the sky. Snow continued falling, although the wind had finally begun to weaken. Dawn remained more than an hour away. "The roads will not improve until morning," he said. Driving alone would not be the safest decision. Rebecca glanced toward her aging vehicle. She knew he was right. The fuel gauge had already dropped lower than she liked, and several secondary roads were almost invisible beneath fresh snow. "There is a lodge less than 15 minutes from here," Daniel added. "Our people cleared the entrance earlier tonight. It is warm, and the owner keeps rooms available during storms." Rebecca hesitated. "I do not want to inconvenience anyone." Luca answered before Daniel could speak. "You already prevented the greatest inconvenience imaginable." His calm tone carried no trace of exaggeration. "Please allow us to return the favor." Rebecca looked around the quiet convoy. Everyone appeared ready to leave, yet nobody seemed impatient. The entire group simply waited for her answer. It was strangely respectful. Finally she nodded. "One night. Then I will be out of your way tomorrow morning." Lucy beamed. "That means pancakes." Rebecca laughed again, unable to resist the little girl's excitement. Within minutes the convoy began moving. Rebecca followed Daniel's vehicle while Luca's sport utility vehicle remained directly behind her old Ford, almost as though quietly ensuring she would never become separated from the group. The narrow mountain road wound through towering pine trees coated in heavy snow. Their branches sparkled beneath the convoy's headlights, transforming the forest into something that looked almost unreal. Rebecca found herself relaxing for the first time since spotting Lucy beside the highway. Every few miles she caught glimpses of the lead vehicles carefully checking side roads before continuing forward. Whoever these people were, preparation seemed woven into everything they did. What she did not know was that several additional vehicles had quietly remained behind to continue searching the surrounding forest, not for Lucy, but for any sign that someone else might have followed her footprints before Rebecca found her. Less than 20 minutes later, the convoy reached a secluded mountain lodge built from thick timber and riverstone. Warm golden light spilled through the windows, creating a striking contrast against the blue darkness outside. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, carrying the unmistakable scent of burning pine. Rebecca stepped inside and immediately felt warmth surround her. The crackling fireplace filled the large lobby with soft amber light. Wooden beams stretched across the high ceiling, while old photographs of snowy mountains decorated the walls. Everything about the place felt peaceful. The elderly owner greeted Luca with quiet familiarity, offering no surprised questions despite the unusual hour or the long line of arriving vehicles. Rebecca noticed that everyone seemed to know exactly where to go without unnecessary conversation. A mug of hot chocolate appeared in Lucy's hands within moments. Someone quietly brought Rebecca a steaming cup of coffee without asking whether she wanted one. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug and closed her eyes for a brief second. The heat spread slowly through her frozen fingers. Across the room, Luca removed his overcoat and carefully knelt beside Lucy as she happily described finding Rebecca on the roadside. He listened to every word with complete attention, never interrupting her excitement. Rebecca watched from beside the fireplace, realizing she had spent hours imagining the powerful stranger everyone seemed determined to protect. The man standing before her looked nothing like the frightening figure she might have expected. Unfortunately for her, first impressions often revealed only part of the truth, and before sunrise finally reached the mountains, Rebecca would begin noticing small details inside the quiet lodge that suggested Luca Moretti's life was far more complicated than any ordinary father could ever explain. Morning arrived slowly across the mountains, turning the snow outside the lodge into a sea of pale gold. Rebecca stood beside the wide dining room window with a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands. The storm had finally passed, leaving the surrounding forest perfectly still. Pine branches bowed beneath fresh snow, and sunlight reflected across the frozen landscape with almost blinding brightness. For the first time since the previous evening, everything looked peaceful, yet something about the lodge continued to hold her attention. It was not luxury that made it unusual. The furniture was comfortable rather than extravagant. The walls displayed old photographs of local families instead of expensive artwork. The difference was the people. Every employee seemed to know exactly what needed to be done before anyone asked. Every visitor greeted Luca with quiet respect instead of casual familiarity. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody lingered unnecessarily. It felt less like fear than absolute trust built over many years. Rebecca noticed Daniel speaking briefly with another man near the entrance before both quietly stepped outside without disturbing anyone. Moments later, Lucy raced into the dining room wearing fresh winter clothes and carrying the same stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. "You stayed," she announced happily. Rebecca laughed. "I said I would." Lucy climbed into the chair beside her and proudly unfolded a drawing for breakfast. It showed a little red vehicle surrounded by snow, a smiling woman in a blue coat, and a much larger man standing beneath tall pine trees. Rebecca recognized herself immediately. Lucy pointed toward the tallest figure. "That is Daddy." Rebecca smiled. "He looks very heroic." Lucy tilted her head. "He is just Daddy." The simple answer somehow carried more meaning than any long explanation could have. A few minutes later, Luca entered the dining room wearing a dark charcoal sweater instead of the formal clothing Rebecca had expected. Without the overcoat and winter gloves, almost like any father enjoying breakfast with his daughter after a frightening night. He greeted several employees by name before walking to their table. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope you were able to rest." Rebecca nodded. "Better than I expected. The road should reopen within another hour." He paused before adding, "There is no hurry if you would rather wait until conditions improve." Rebecca appreciated the offer but smiled politely. "I have work tomorrow." Reality eventually catches everyone. Luca almost smiled again. "That it does." Arrived quickly. Fresh pancakes, eggs, maple syrup, and hot coffee filled the table while Lucy happily explained every detail of her adventure from the previous night. She described the warm blanket, the crackers, the weather radio, and Rebecca's old sport utility vehicle as though recounting the greatest journey of her life. Rebecca noticed Luca listening with complete attention, never checking a phone, never allowing anyone else to interrupt. Whatever responsibilities waited beyond these mountains, they remained outside the dining room while his daughter spoke. Unfortunately for Rebecca, she did not notice the brief exchange occurring near the lobby. Daniel quietly handed Luca a small envelope before immediately stepping away. Luca opened it without changing expression, glanced at a single page inside, then folded it just as quickly and slipped it into his pocket before returning his full attention to Lucy. Rebecca only caught the movement from the corner of her eye. She assumed it was business, nothing more. After breakfast, she thanked the lodge owner and gathered her coat. The parking lot sparkled beneath the bright winter sun while crews cleared the remaining snow from the entrance road. Her old Ford looked almost tiny beside the line of polished black sport utility vehicles. She brushed snow from the windshield and reached for the driver's door when she heard footsteps behind her. Luca approached carrying a small insulated package. "The kitchen insisted," he said. "Coffee and sandwiches for the drive." Rebecca accepted the package with genuine surprise. "Please thank them for me. They already know." Another brief silence settled comfortably between them. Rebecca looked toward the highway stretching through the mountains. "I still feel like I accidentally stepped into someone else's life yesterday." Luca followed her gaze. "Sometimes life introduces strangers at exactly the right moment." Rebecca hesitated before asking the question that had quietly lingered since the search convoy first appeared. "May I ask something?" "Of course. How did so many people find Lucy so quickly?" Luca remained silent for a few seconds. His answer, when it came, was careful but honest. "I have spent many years building relationships with people who take care of one another. Last night everyone simply helped a little faster than usual. It was not a complete explanation, but neither did it feel like a lie." Rebecca accepted it without pressing further. She climbed into her vehicle and started the engine. Before closing the door, she looked back one last time. Lucy waved both arms enthusiastically from the lodge porch, while Daniel stood nearby with an easy smile. Luca simply raised one hand in a quiet farewell. Rebecca smiled and pulled onto the cleared mountain road. The lodge slowly disappeared behind the towering pines until only sunlight remained dancing across untouched snow. She believed the extraordinary chapter of her life had ended as unexpectedly as it had begun. What she could not possibly know was that less than 5 minutes after her vehicle disappeared beyond the first mountain curve, Daniel quietly turned toward Luca and asked a single question. "Should we continue watching over her?" Luca never took his eyes off the empty road. After a thoughtful pause, he answered softly, "Only if she never realizes why." Rebecca expected life to settle back into familiar routines after leaving the mountains, yet ordinary days felt strangely different. The drive home passed beneath clear winter skies, and by late afternoon she was back in her small apartment outside Bozeman. Snow still covered the sidewalks, grocery stores bustled with holiday shoppers, and her neighbors shoveled driveways as though nothing extraordinary had happened over the weekend. She unpacked her overnight bag, placed the insulated package from the lodge inside her refrigerator, and tried convincing herself that the entire experience belonged to another lifetime. Monday morning arrived with the comforting rhythm of normal life. Rebecca spent the day organizing donations at the community center where she volunteered, helping local families prepare winter food boxes and warm clothing for people who needed them most. Children laughed in the hallway while volunteers decorated paper snowflakes across the windows. The familiar sounds reminded her why she loved serving her community. Still, every now and then her thoughts drifted back to Lucy's bright smile and Luca's calm voice. She wondered whether they had returned safely to whatever quiet life waited beyond those mountains. She assumed she would never see any of them again. Unfortunately for her assumption, someone else had not forgotten the meeting quite so easily. Less than a mile away, a dark sport utility vehicle remained parked across the street from the community center. It never blocked traffic, it never followed too closely. It simply remained present for several hours before, quietly driving away each afternoon. Rebecca never noticed it. She was too busy carrying donation boxes, greeting visitors, and helping elderly couples load groceries into their cars. Daniel watched from the driver's seat only long enough to confirm that nothing unusual surrounded her routine before leaving without speaking to anyone. Luca had given one clear instruction: Protect from a distance. Never interfere unless absolutely necessary. 3 days passed peacefully. On Thursday evening, Rebecca stopped at a neighborhood grocery store after work. The parking lot was crowded with families preparing for the holidays. She filled her shopping cart with soup, bread, coffee, fruit, and extra blankets that the community center planned to distribute over the weekend. While waiting in the checkout line, she noticed a familiar red knit hat several aisles away. Her heart skipped before she realized it belonged to another little girl entirely. She smiled at herself. The mountains had clearly left a stronger impression than she wanted to admit. As she carried groceries toward her vehicle, the winter wind suddenly picked up again. Several shopping bags slipped from her hands, scattering canned food across the icy pavement. Before she could bend down, another pair of hands calmly collected the rolling cans one by one. "Looks like winter is still winning," a familiar voice said. Rebecca looked up in surprise. Luca stood beside her wearing a simple dark pea coat, blue jeans and leather gloves instead of the formal clothing she remembered from the lodge. Without the convoy or the mountain setting, he blended almost effortlessly into the ordinary crowd around them. Only his quiet confidence remained unmistakable. "You are a long way from the mountains," Rebecca said with genuine surprise. "Business brought me here," he answered as he handed her the final grocery bag. "Lucy insisted I ask whether the lady with the warm blanket ever made it home safely." Rebecca laughed softly. "Please tell her I did. She also asked whether you still plan to have pancakes with her someday." Rebecca smiled. "She remembers that?" "She remembers everything." The conversation flowed more naturally than either of them expected. They walked together toward Rebecca's vehicle, while shoppers moved around them, carrying wreaths, wrapped gifts, and steaming cups of coffee. Nobody paid special attention to the two strangers speaking beside an old Ford in a crowded parking lot. Rebecca noticed that Luca never looked distracted. Even while listening, he quietly observed the icy pavement, passing traffic, and the elderly couple struggling to load groceries into a nearby sedan. Without interrupting their conversation, he crossed the lane, lifted the heaviest bags into the couple's trunk, wished them a pleasant evening, and returned as though it required no recognition whatsoever. Rebecca found herself smiling. "You seem to help people whenever you notice they need it." Luca looked almost amused by the observation. "I learned a long time ago that kindness costs less than regret." The sentence stayed with her. It sounded practiced, not because it had been rehearsed for strangers, but because it had been earned through experience. Snowflakes began drifting lazily across the parking lot once again. Rebecca unlocked her vehicle and placed the groceries inside. "I suppose Lucy is disappointed that I did not bring pancakes." Luca smiled more openly than she had seen before. She may have mentioned it once or twice. Rebecca reached into one of her grocery bags, removed a small package of maple cookies she had planned to bring to the community center, and handed it to him. "Then perhaps these can serve as a temporary apology." Luca accepted the simple gift with visible surprise. "She will probably tell everyone they are the greatest cookies ever made." Children are generous reviewers. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Across the parking lot, neither of them noticed Daniel quietly lowering his phone after confirming to the rest of the security team that everything remained peaceful. What Rebecca also did not notice was that Luca had arrived at the grocery store nearly 20 minutes before she did. Whether coincidence or careful planning had brought them together again remained a question that neither of them was yet ready to ask. The days leading up to Christmas transformed Bozeman into a postcard of glowing storefronts, fresh evergreen wreaths, and quiet streets dusted with new snow. Rebecca found herself smiling more often than she had in months, although she could not fully explain why. She blamed it on the season, on the families she helped at the community center, and on the memory of one little girl whose laughter somehow lingered in her thoughts. She certainly did not expect to see Luca again so soon, yet life seemed determined to place their paths together in ways that felt almost accidental. On Saturday afternoon, the community center hosted its annual winter festival. Local musicians played holiday songs, while volunteers served hot chocolate beside a large stone fireplace. Children decorated gingerbread cookies, seniors exchanged homemade scarves, and every table overflowed with donated toys waiting to be delivered before Christmas morning. Rebecca spent most of the afternoon organizing gift boxes until she heard an excited voice call her name from across the room. "Rebecca!" She turned just in time to see Lucy running carefully through the crowd with the stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. Rebecca laughed and knelt to greet her. "You remembered me?" Lucy looked genuinely shocked. "Of course I remembered you." Before Rebecca could answer, Luca approached at a slower pace, carrying 2 paper cups filled with hot chocolate. He wore a simple navy winter coat, blending naturally into the festive crowd. Without the convoy surrounding him, he appeared almost anonymous. "I hope we are not interrupting," he said. Rebecca accepted one of the cups with a grateful smile. "Not at all. I did not know you were coming." Luca glanced toward Lucy, who was already helping younger children arrange ornaments on a nearby tree. "She saw a flyer online and informed me that attendance was apparently mandatory." Rebecca smiled. "She is persuasive, exceptionally." The 3 of them wandered through the festival together, while Lucy enthusiastically introduced Rebecca to every handmade decoration she considered important. She proudly displayed paper snowflakes, wooden reindeer, and a tiny ceramic snowman painted slightly crooked by one of the younger children. Rebecca noticed something that surprised her even more than Luca's appearance at the event. Every volunteer who met him walked away smiling. He quietly purchased raffle tickets for charity without mentioning the amount. He thanked every server by name after reading the small name tags pinned to their sweaters. When one elderly volunteer struggled to move several heavy boxes, he simply picked them up and carried them inside without attracting attention. Rebecca watched the small moments more carefully than the obvious ones. They revealed a man who seemed entirely comfortable helping without expecting recognition. Unfortunately for her, another observation slowly began taking shape. Every few minutes someone new appeared nearby. A man browsing holiday books, a woman standing beside the coffee table, another volunteer watching the entrance. They never spoke directly to Luca unless necessary, yet they subtly acknowledged him with brief nods before disappearing again. Rebecca finally asked quietly, "Do you always have so many friends nearby?" Luca looked toward the choir singing beside the Christmas tree before answering. "Some people stay close because they believe it is their responsibility." Responsibility for what? His expression remained thoughtful, making certain the people they care about arrive home safely. It was still not a complete explanation, but this time Rebecca noticed something else. The answer carried quiet weight, as though the responsibility had cost everyone involved more than she understood. Before she could ask another question, Lucy grabbed both of their hands. "Come with me." She led them toward a large wooden table where children were decorating gingerbread houses with colorful candy. Without hesitation, Lucy placed Rebecca on one side of the table and Luca on the other before announcing proudly, "Now we are a team." Rebecca laughed. "I did not realize teams were assigned. I assigned it." Luca looked almost defeated in the face of such cheerful determination. "Then I suppose the decision is final." They spent the next half hour carefully decorating the tiny gingerbread house, while Lucy enthusiastically covered nearly every empty surface with gumdrops and peppermint candies. Frosting ended up on Rebecca's sleeve, on Lucy's mitten, and even on Luca's wrist after an especially enthusiastic decorating attempt. Rebecca caught herself laughing more freely than she had in years. The moment felt remarkably ordinary, despite everything unusual that had brought them together. As the afternoon faded into evening, the outdoor lights surrounding the community center slowly illuminated the falling snow. Families gathered outside to watch the annual tree lighting ceremony. Rebecca stood beside Luca while Lucy counted down excitedly with the rest of the crowd. The enormous evergreen suddenly burst into thousands of warm golden lights, drawing cheers from everyone watching. For a brief moment nobody spoke. They simply admired the quiet beauty of the glowing tree against the snowy Montana sky. Then Rebecca noticed a black sedan parked across the street. 2 unfamiliar men remained inside without stepping out, watching the community center far longer than ordinary visitors would have. Before she could mention it, Daniel quietly appeared beside Luca. He spoke only 4 words, almost too softly to hear. They found this location. Luca's eyes remained on the Christmas tree, but something subtle changed in his expression. Calm remained, warmth remained. Yet beneath both appeared the unmistakable focus of someone who had just realized the peaceful afternoon might not remain peaceful much longer. Rebecca noticed the change in Luca before anyone else seemed to react. He did not turn abruptly toward Daniel or rush to the parking lot. Instead, he remained beside Lucy until the little girl finished admiring the glowing Christmas tree. Only then did he kneel beside her and quietly ask whether she wanted another cup of hot chocolate inside. Lucy nodded happily, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Daniel immediately offered to take her to the refreshment table while Luca stayed behind with Rebecca. Snow drifted gently across the courtyard as families laughed beneath strings of golden lights. The music continued. Children chased one another through the fresh snow, and nothing outwardly suggested that the atmosphere had shifted. Rebecca looked toward Luca. "Something is wrong, isn't it?" He hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "I hope not." She folded her arms against the cold. "That does not sound very convincing." A faint smile crossed his face before fading again. "There are times when people from my past become curious about my present." Rebecca studied him carefully. "Earlier you said people stayed close because they wanted to keep others safe. Is that what this is about?" Luca looked across the street toward the parked sedan without making it obvious. "Partly." Rebecca followed his gaze. The dark vehicle remained where it had been only minutes earlier. The occupants never stepped outside. They simply watched the community center with quiet patience. "Do you know them?" she asked. "No," Luca answered calmly, which is exactly why Daniel noticed them. Rebecca felt an unexpected chill despite her warm winter coat. Nothing threatening had happened. Nobody approached them, yet the quiet certainty in Luca's voice made the ordinary parking lot suddenly feel much larger. What she did not know was that Daniel had already confirmed the sedan had appeared outside 2 different locations during the previous week. The people inside had never broken any laws. They had never spoken to anyone connected to Luca. They had simply watched from a distance before leaving. That pattern alone was enough to concern him. Luca gently changed the subject before Rebecca could ask another question. "Would you like to walk inside? It is warmer." She nodded, grateful for the distraction. The community center buzzed with cheerful conversation as volunteers prepared the final gift boxes for delivery. Lucy stood proudly behind the hot chocolate table wearing an oversized apron while carefully handing marshmallows to younger children under Daniel's patient supervision. Rebecca smiled at the sight. She seems to trust him completely. Daniel has been part of our family for longer than Lucy can remember. Rebecca noticed the word family, not employee, not security family. The distinction stayed with her. Together they helped carry several donation boxes toward the loading area behind the building. Rebecca appreciated how naturally Luca worked beside the volunteers. He never acted as though any task belonged beneath him. He folded cardboard boxes, carried heavy containers, and thanked every person who accepted his help. Several volunteers assumed he had simply arrived to support the holiday event like everyone else. Nobody recognized the invisible network quietly protecting him from a respectful distance. As the final truck pulled away carrying gifts for local families, the elderly director of the community center approached Rebecca with a warm smile. "Your friend has been incredibly generous today," she whispered. Rebecca looked confused. "What do you mean?" The director lowered her voice even further. "He quietly covered every remaining expense for the holiday food program before anyone could ask where the funding would come from." Rebecca turned toward Luca, who happened to be helping a child tie a loose scarf near the entrance. There had been no announcement, no public recognition, no speech. She suddenly remembered the raffle tickets, the grocery store, the elderly couple, the lodge, and the countless small acts of kindness that seemed almost invisible unless someone paid close attention. When Luca returned, Rebecca looked at him differently. He shrugged gently. "The families receiving the meals do not care where the money came from. They only care that dinner reaches their table." Rebecca smiled quietly. "You really believe kindness should stay anonymous?" "Sometimes anonymous kindness lasts." Before she could answer, Daniel approached once more. This time his expression had relaxed noticeably. "The sedan just left town," he said softly. Luca nodded once. "Thank you." Rebecca heard every word. "So everything is fine now?" Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Luca before replying carefully, "For tonight." The answer should have reassured her. Instead, it raised even more questions. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the Christmas lights, while families slowly returned home carrying gifts and laughter into the winter evening. Rebecca watched Luca place his coat around Lucy's shoulders before lifting her into his arms after she fell asleep from the excitement of the day. The little girl rested peacefully against him without waking. It was an ordinary image. A father carrying his tired daughter through softly falling snow. Yet as Rebecca watched them walk toward the parking lot, she realized something that unsettled her more than the mysterious sedan ever could. She had begun trusting a man whose life remained almost entirely unknown to her, and somewhere deep inside she was no longer certain that she wanted those unanswered questions to stay unanswered forever. The week after the holiday festival settled into an unexpected rhythm, Rebecca returned to the community center each morning, believing the unusual chapter of her life would gradually fade into memory. Yet small reminders seemed to appear everywhere. A handwritten thank you card arrived from an elderly couple who had received groceries during the holiday drive. Several anonymous donations appeared at the front desk without return addresses. The director smiled more often because the center suddenly had enough funding to continue several programs through the spring. Nobody knew where the additional support had come from. Rebecca suspected the answer long before anyone else did, although she never mentioned Luca's name. One quiet afternoon she stayed late organizing storage shelves after the other volunteers had gone home. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the building settled into peaceful silence. She carried a box of children's books toward the library corner when the director approached holding a thick envelope. "This arrived for you," the older woman said. "There is no return address." Rebecca thanked her and waited until she was alone before opening it. Inside she found a simple handwritten note resting beside a folded drawing. The drawing immediately made her smile. Lucy had sketched 3 figures standing beneath a large evergreen tree covered with stars. One held a stuffed rabbit. Another wore a blue winter coat. The tallest figure stood between them with one hand resting gently on the little girl's shoulder. Across the top, written in careful block letters, were the words, "Thank you for finding my way home." Rebecca carefully traced the edge of the paper with her fingertips before unfolding the short note beneath it. The handwriting belonged to Luca. It contained only a few sentences. Lucy insisted that her drawing belonged with the person who inspired it. "She also asked me to remind you that the invitation for pancakes has not expired. I hope the new year has treated you kindly." Rebecca folded the note again with a quiet smile. It was thoughtful without asking for anything in return. She placed both papers carefully inside her notebook before locking the office for the evening. What she did not know was that Daniel had personally delivered the envelope earlier that morning after confirming Rebecca was safely inside the building. The habit of quiet protection had not disappeared. It had simply become less visible. 2 days later, Rebecca finally decided to answer. She purchased a small watercolor painting from a local artist showing snow-covered mountains beneath a bright sunrise. On the back, she wrote a short message thanking Lucy for her beautiful drawing and promising that pancakes would eventually happen. She hesitated before adding one final sentence addressed to Luca. Some acts of kindness deserve to be remembered instead of repaid. She mailed the package without expecting an immediate response. The following Saturday, her phone rang while she was cleaning her apartment. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" A bright little voice immediately replied. "You remembered." Rebecca laughed before saying a single word. "Hello, Lucy." The child sounded delighted. "Daddy said you might answer. Did you like the painting? It is hanging in our kitchen already." Rebecca smiled as she imagined the picture resting somewhere inside the mountain home she had never seen beyond one snowy night. Lucy continued, talking excitedly about school, her rabbit, and the enormous amount of pancakes she believed adults should consume every weekend. Eventually, another familiar voice entered the conversation. "I believe she has now shared every important detail from the past 3 days, Luca said with quiet amusement. "She forgot to mention the cookies," Lucy whispered loudly enough for Rebecca to hear. "Apparently I did." They laughed together, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Rebecca leaned against the kitchen counter. Realizing she no longer felt like she was speaking with strangers, there was comfort in the silence between sentences, the kind that usually belonged only to old friends. Luca finally spoke more seriously. "Lucy would like to invite you to the ranch next weekend if your schedule allows." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "The ranch? Our home," he paused. "There is no pressure. She simply asks every morning whether the pancake promise still exists." Rebecca looked through her apartment window toward the snow falling outside. Accepting the invitation felt strangely significant. It meant stepping beyond the carefully limited glimpse she had seen so far into whatever life Luca truly lived. "I would like that," she answered honestly. "Then we will make certain there are enough pancakes to satisfy her impossible standards." After the call ended, Rebecca remained standing quietly in her kitchen with the phone still in her hand. She realized she had just accepted an invitation into a world she still barely understood. Unfortunately for her, someone else learned about that invitation almost as quickly. Less than an hour later, inside a quiet office many miles away. An unidentified man placed a photograph of Rebecca beside another photograph of Luca and Lucy before calmly saying, "The woman from the Snowstorm is becoming part of their lives." The room fell silent, and although no threats were spoken, it became clear that Rebecca's unexpected act of kindness had begun reaching people she had never intended to meet. Saturday morning arrived beneath a clear blue Montana sky, the kind that made fresh snow sparkle like scattered glass beneath the winter sun. Rebecca drove north with a small cooler filled with homemade pancake batter and a tin of blueberry muffins balanced carefully on the passenger seat. She smiled at the thought that Lucy would probably declare the breakfast incomplete unless it contained enough syrup to cover the entire table. The highway gradually gave way to quiet country roads lined with fences, open fields, and snow-covered pine trees. The directions Luca had given her were surprisingly simple, ending at a wide wooden gate overlooking several hundred acres of rolling land. A modest stone sign displayed only the name Moretti Ranch. There was no display of wealth, no towering entrance, no unnecessary extravagance. It looked like a family ranch that had stood there for generations. The gate opened before Rebecca reached it. She slowed her vehicle and continued along the winding driveway until the main house appeared beyond a cluster of tall evergreens. It was large without feeling imposing, built from timber and natural stone that blended into the surrounding landscape. Horses grazed peacefully in a distant pasture while smoke drifted lazily from a massive stone chimney. Before Rebecca even stepped out of her vehicle, the front door burst open. Lucy ran down the porch steps bundled in a bright winter coat, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath one arm. "You came," she shouted with absolute joy. Rebecca laughed as she carefully climbed out of the vehicle. "I promised pancakes, remember?" Lucy nodded enthusiastically before proudly accepting the tin of muffins as though it contained priceless treasure. Daniel appeared on the porch a moment later, greeting Rebecca with the same warm smile she remembered from the mountains. "Welcome back," he said. "Lucy has reminded everyone about this visit at least twice every day." "Only twice?" Rebecca asked playfully. Daniel smiled. On quieter days, Luca stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Sunlight reflected softly across the snow behind him while the ranch seemed almost impossibly peaceful. "I was beginning to think Lucy would start driving to town herself if you were late." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully. "I did not realize I had become so important." Luca looked toward his daughter arranging muffins proudly on the outdoor table. "To her you have." Those simple words carried more weight than Rebecca expected. Inside the house, warmth surrounded every room. Family photographs covered the walls instead of expensive paintings. Most of them showed Lucy growing older through birthdays, horseback rides, fishing trips, and holiday celebrations. Rebecca noticed one photograph of Luca standing beside an older gray-haired gentleman near the same ranch house many years earlier. Another showed Lucy as a baby asleep on Luca's shoulder. Every picture emphasized family rather than status. They gathered around the large farmhouse kitchen while pancakes sizzled on the cast-iron griddle. Lucy insisted on helping Rebecca flip each one, although several emerged in shapes that resembled mountains more than circles. Everyone laughed anyway. Conversation flowed easily from favorite books to winter traditions, local wildlife, and funny stories from Lucy's school. Rebecca found herself relaxing completely, forgetting the mystery that had quietly surrounded Luca since the night they met. It was difficult to reconcile the peaceful ranch with the disciplined convoy, the silent security teams, and the unexplained caution that still lingered around him. Unfortunately for Rebecca, answers sometimes arrived when people stopped searching for them. After breakfast, Lucy asked Rebecca to help feed the horses. They crossed the snowy yard carrying buckets of grain while Luca remained behind to answer a phone call inside the house. Rebecca watched Lucy confidently greet each horse by name before carefully offering handfuls of feed through the fence. "Daddy says animals know who tells the truth," Lucy explained. Rebecca smiled. "Do you believe that?" "Yes." Lucy looked thoughtfully toward the house. "Daddy always tells me the truth, even when it is difficult." The innocent statement stayed with Rebecca as they returned toward the barn. As they rounded the corner, 2 unfamiliar pickup trucks rolled slowly through the front gate, stopped several yards from the house. 4 men stepped out wearing heavy winter jackets with the logo of a regional agricultural cooperative embroidered across their chests. Nothing about their appearance seemed threatening. They carried folders instead of equipment, smiled politely, and waited near their vehicles. Luca walked out to meet them, while Daniel remained quietly beside the porch. Rebecca assumed they were discussing ranch business until she noticed something unusual. The visitors greeted Luca with unmistakable respect. One older gentleman removed his hat before shaking his hand. Another thanked him repeatedly for helping keep several neighboring ranches operating after a difficult drought the previous summer. "Without your support, half of us would have lost everything," the man said sincerely. Rebecca overheard only fragments while standing beside the barn, yet each sentence quietly reshaped the image she had formed in her mind. These people were not afraid of Luca. They were grateful to him. A few minutes later, the visitors drove away smiling. Rebecca looked at Daniel with open curiosity. "Does everyone around here know him?" Daniel watched the trucks disappear down the long driveway before answering carefully. "Around these parts, people know that if they are facing their worst day, Luca usually arrives before anyone else does." Rebecca remained silent. Piece by piece, the puzzle she had been trying to solve no longer resembled the one she had imagined, yet one important piece still remained hidden. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the snowy fields, Rebecca noticed a closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was the only room Lucy had never mentioned, the only door that remained locked, and the only place inside the warm family home that seemed untouched by laughter. Rebecca tried not to think about the locked room for the rest of the afternoon. She reminded herself that every family deserved private spaces and memories that belonged only to them. Still, curiosity quietly lingered as she helped Lucy brush the horses, gather fresh eggs from the small barn, and scatter birdseed across the snowy yard. The ranch felt peaceful in a way that seemed impossible to fake. Every employee greeted Lucy with genuine affection. Every animal appeared calm. Even the winter silence carried a sense of home rather than isolation. As the sun slowly lowered behind the distant mountains, golden light stretched across the snow and turned the entire valley into a landscape that looked almost painted. Rebecca stood near the fence watching the horses, while Lucy chased tiny sparrows that always stayed just beyond her reach. Luca walked over carrying 2 mugs of hot cider. He handed one to Rebecca before leaning quietly against the wooden fence beside her. For several moments neither of them spoke. They simply watched Lucy laugh beneath the fading afternoon light. "She likes having you here," Luca finally said. Rebecca smiled without looking away from the field. "I like being here," he nodded slowly. "That surprises me." "Why? Most people become uncomfortable once they realize my life is different." Rebecca looked toward him. "Your life is different, but different is not always bad." A faint smile crossed his face. "You make simple things sound wiser than they are." Rebecca laughed softly. "That is probably because I spend my days around children. They have a way of simplifying everything." The comfortable silence returned until Rebecca quietly asked the question she had been avoiding for weeks. "May I ask you something personal?" Luca looked at her without hesitation. "Yes. Lucy talks about you constantly." "She never talks about Godfather." The smile faded from Luca's face, replaced not by pain exactly, but by the quiet expression of someone remembering a chapter that had never fully closed. He watched the snow drift across the pasture before answering. "Her mother passed away when Lucy was very young." Rebecca lowered her eyes immediately. "I am sorry. I should not have asked." "No," his voice remained calm. "You asked because you care about Lucy." He took a slow breath before continuing. "Her mother believed that kindness mattered more than success. She spent her life helping families who had almost nothing. Lucy inherited her heart." Rebecca felt unexpected emotion settle over her. Suddenly many small pieces fit together: the anonymous donations, the quiet generosity, the habit of helping without recognition. They were not random acts. They were promises someone had continued keeping long after loss had entered his life. What Rebecca did not know was that the locked room upstairs had once belonged entirely to Lucy's mother. Luca had never changed it. Every photograph, every book, every handwritten note remained exactly where she had left them years before. He visited the room alone only a handful of times each year, never allowing grief to become a burden Lucy needed to carry. As twilight settled across the ranch, Lucy ran toward them holding a tiny wooden ornament shaped like a snowflake. "I made this at school," she announced proudly. "Daddy keeps forgetting to hang it." Luca accepted the ornament with exaggerated seriousness. "Then we have committed a terrible mistake." Lucy nodded dramatically. "A very terrible mistake." Rebecca laughed as the three of them walked back toward the house together. Inside, the living room glowed beneath the warm light of a towering Christmas tree decorated with family ornaments collected over many years. Lucy carefully selected the highest branch she could reach before handing the snowflake to Rebecca. "You should hang it." Rebecca looked surprised. "Are you sure you found me?" The simple answer left no room for argument. Rebecca carefully placed the handmade ornament near the center of the tree. It was not the most beautiful decoration among the sparkling lights and glass ornaments, yet somehow it became the one everyone noticed first. Luca stood quietly beside the fireplace watching the scene. Daniel entered carrying a stack of mail but stopped when he saw Lucy smiling proudly at the tree. He quietly set the letters aside without interrupting the moment. Dinner that evening felt less like visiting strangers and more like sharing a meal with people who had somehow become important in a remarkably short time. They talked about favorite books, childhood memories, local wildlife, and plans for spring. Rebecca found herself laughing easily, no longer measuring every word. When it finally became time to leave, Lucy hugged her tightly before whispering, "You have to come back." Rebecca smiled and gently squeezed her shoulder. "I would like that very much." Luca walked Rebecca to her vehicle beneath a sky filled with brilliant winter stars. The ranch behind them had grown quiet. Wrapped once again in peaceful silence, Rebecca turned toward him before opening the driver's door. "Thank you for trusting me enough to invite me here." Luca looked across the snowy fields before answering with complete honesty. "The truth is, Rebecca, you earned that trust the night you stopped your car for a frightened little girl when everyone else kept driving." Before Rebecca could respond, she noticed Daniel standing several yards away, holding the stack of unopened mail. One envelope rested separately in his hand. Even from the distance she could see that his expression had changed. He waited until Rebecca entered her vehicle before quietly approaching Luca and handing him the envelope. Luca opened it beneath the porch light, read only the first few lines, and for the first time since Rebecca had met him, the calm certainty in his eyes gave way to unmistakable concern. Rebecca did not notice the change in Luca's expression as she drove away from the ranch. The winding road carried her back toward town beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, and her thoughts remained fixed on Lucy's laughter, the warm farmhouse kitchen, and the quiet honesty that seemed to define every corner of the property. For the first time in many years, she found herself looking forward to seeing someone again, instead of simply remembering them. Back at the ranch, however, the peaceful evening shifted in a different direction. Daniel remained on the porch while Luca unfolded the letter completely beneath the warm glow of the exterior light. It was typed on plain white paper without a signature or return address. There were only 2 sentences. "We know the woman from the storm has become part of your family. Be careful who pays the price for your gratitude." Daniel quietly waited for Luca to finish reading. "There is nothing else?" he asked. Luca shook his head. "Nothing." He folded the paper once more before placing it inside his coat pocket. "Someone wants attention. Should we inform the sheriff?" Daniel asked. Luca looked toward the quiet ranch where Lucy had already fallen asleep after an exciting day. "There is no crime in anonymous paper." He paused before adding, "But there is intention." Daniel nodded. "What about Rebecca?" Luca answered almost immediately. "She is not to be frightened by something that has not happened." The following Monday morning, Rebecca returned to the community center, believing life had resumed its familiar rhythm. Children gathered for after-school programs, volunteers organized donated winter coats, and the director proudly announced that enough funding had arrived to expand several educational projects into the spring. Rebecca smiled, knowing exactly whose generosity had quietly made those plans possible. She never mentioned his name because she suspected he would have preferred it that way. What she did not know was that Daniel had driven past the building twice that morning, confirming nothing unusual surrounded the property before continuing on his way. The anonymous letter remained in Luca's pocket, but not once did he consider allowing fear to reshape Rebecca's ordinary life. 2 evenings later, Rebecca received another phone call from Lucy. The little girl excitedly described a school science project involving bird feeders and insisted that Rebecca had to judge the final result because, according to Lucy, she was the most honest person she knew. Rebecca laughed warmly and promised she would visit again soon. Before ending the call, she asked whether Luca was nearby. A moment later, his familiar voice replaced Lucy's cheerful excitement. "I believe I owe you an apology," he said. Rebecca sounded surprised. "For what?" "Lucy now believes every weekend should include pancakes with you." Rebecca smiled. "That sounds like a very manageable problem." Their conversation drifted naturally from books to community projects and eventually to the families Rebecca helped every week. She described children who needed winter boots, elderly neighbors living alone, and single parents struggling through difficult seasons. Luca listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one simple question. "If resources were unlimited, what would you build first?" Rebecca answered without hesitation. A permanent family resource center. One place where people could find food, tutoring, counseling, job assistance, and childcare without feeling embarrassed for asking. Silence followed for several thoughtful seconds. That is a beautiful idea, Luca said quietly. Rebecca laughed. It is also a very expensive idea. Sometimes worthwhile things are. They ended the conversation with the comfortable ease of two people who no longer searched for reasons to keep talking. Across town, Luca remained standing beside the window of his study long after the call ended. Daniel entered carrying several folders, but noticed the thoughtful expression on his friend's face. "You are thinking about the center," he said. Luca nodded. "She dreams about helping strangers she will never meet." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds familiar." Luca looked out across the snowy fields. "It reminds me of someone I once loved." Neither man needed to say another word. The memory was already understood. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at work to discover several architects studying the vacant lot beside the community center. Curious, she asked the director what was happening. The older woman looked almost speechless. "Someone purchased the property overnight and donated it to the center." Rebecca stared across the snow-covered ground in disbelief. "Who?" The director slowly unfolded a legal document. "The papers only identify a private charitable foundation." Rebecca immediately thought of Luca but pushed the idea aside. It seemed impossible that anyone could make such a decision so quickly. What she did not know was that the foundation had existed for years, quietly supporting schools, clinics, ranches, and community projects across the state without attaching the Moretti name to any of them. The anonymous letter had reminded Luca of something he refused to surrender. Fear could protect a family, but it could also imprison it. He would not allow either Rebecca or Lucy to grow up believing kindness should retreat simply because someone wished it would. Standing beside the empty lot, Rebecca watched fresh snow settle gently across the frozen ground and imagined children laughing there someday inside a building that did not yet exist. She had no idea that the dream she had spoken aloud only days earlier had already begun becoming real, or that the man quietly making it possible had just decided that hiding the truth about his life from her could not continue much longer. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, and with it the empty lot beside the community center transformed into something Rebecca had only imagined during quiet conversations. Construction crews worked from sunrise until evening, volunteers stopped by carrying coffee and homemade lunches, and children pressed their hands against the temporary fence each afternoon, excitedly watching the new building take shape. Nobody knew the identity of the foundation that had made the project possible. The official document simply referred to a private family trust committed to strengthening local communities. Rebecca accepted that answer because she believed some people genuinely preferred doing good without applause. Even so, one question continued lingering quietly in her heart. She wanted to understand Luca completely, not because of his generosity, but because she had begun caring about the man behind it. One warm Saturday afternoon, Luca invited Rebecca and Lucy to walk through the nearly completed resource center before the public opening. Fresh paint scented the hallways, sunlight poured through tall windows, and empty classrooms waited to be filled with books, toys, and hopeful conversations. Lucy raced from room to room, inventing names for each space, while Rebecca stood silently inside the largest gathering room, imagining families sharing meals there during difficult winters. "It is even better than I pictured," she whispered. Luca watched her expression rather than the building itself. "That matters more than you know." They continued walking until they reached a quiet courtyard behind the center where young maple trees had recently been planted. There, away from the workers and cheerful noise, "There is something I should have told you much sooner," he said calmly. Rebecca met his eyes without fear. "I know." He looked surprised. She smiled gently. "Not the details. But I knew there was more to your life than you were ready to share." Luca took a slow breath. "For many years I was part of a world built on power, loyalty, and decisions that often carried heavy consequences. When Lucy was born, and especially after her mother passed away, I began leaving that life behind. I sold businesses that did not belong in her future. I invested in ranches, charitable foundations, and work that could help instead of harm. Some people accepted those choices." Rebecca listened quietly, allowing him to finish. "The letter?" she asked softly. Luca nodded. "An old reminder that the past does not disappear simply because we wish it would. Were Lucy and I ever truly in danger?" Luca answered with complete honesty. "I never believed so, but I refused to gamble with either of your safety." Rebecca remained silent for several moments before stepping closer. Do you know what I have learned since the night of the snowstorm? Luca waited. A person's future tells me far more than their past. The words settled gently between them. Luca looked away for only a second before smiling with a warmth Rebecca had never seen before. It was the smile of someone who had spent years expecting judgment and instead found understanding. At that exact moment, Lucy came running across the courtyard carrying 3 small paper cups filled with lemonade. She stopped in front of them, looked from one face to the other, and smiled knowingly. You both look happier now, Rebecca laughed. Do we? Lucy nodded with complete certainty. That means the hard conversation is finished. Neither adult asked how she had guessed. Some children simply understood people better than anyone expected. Several weeks later, the Community Resource Center officially opened its doors. Families gathered beneath bright blue skies while local musicians played cheerful songs outside. Volunteers welcomed children into colorful classrooms filled with books, art supplies, and warm meals. The mayor thanked the anonymous foundation once again, although no representative stepped forward to accept recognition. Rebecca stood near the entrance greeting families as they arrived. Across the courtyard, she spotted Luca watching quietly beside Lucy and Daniel. He seemed perfectly content, allowing everyone else to celebrate. The director of the center eventually approached Rebecca carrying a small brass plaque that had not yet been mounted. Would you help me choose where this belongs? She asked. Rebecca read the inscription and felt unexpected emotion rise in her chest. It simply said, "This place exists because kindness can change the direction of a single life." She looked toward Luca. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, silently asking her not to mention him. Rebecca smiled. She understood. Together they mounted the plaque near the front entrance where every family would see it without ever learning who had inspired it. That evening, after the celebration ended, Rebecca drove with Luca and Lucy back to the ranch. The sun slowly disappeared behind the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and soft blue. They stopped beside the same quiet stretch of highway where everything had begun months earlier. Fresh wildflowers now covered the roadside where snowdrifts had once stood. Lucy climbed out first and carefully placed a small bouquet beside the shoulder. "For the storm," she explained. Rebecca looked at the peaceful landscape and remembered the frightened little girl standing alone in the blizzard, the old Ford warming its frozen interior, and the impossible convoy emerging through the falling snow before sunrise. One unexpected decision to stop had changed every life connected to that moment. Luca quietly reached for Rebecca's hand, and this time she accepted it without hesitation. Lucy slipped her small hand into both of theirs, smiling as they stood together beneath the wide Montana sky. The wind no longer carried fear. It carried only the promise of another ordinary day shared by people who had become a family not because destiny demanded it, but because kindness had quietly led them there first.